It's a lot of you. Hi. When I was a little kid, I used to have a phobia of wooden slats. If I stepped on the middle of two, I would get sucked down in between them. But I'm okay right now. um, so I'm going to be talking about living design systems. I am a designer. Thanks for letting me sneak into a JavaScript conference. My name's Jina. And as he mentioned, I am a senior product designer at Salesforce. Just a minute. I'm a little winded from coming up the stairs. I also am the design lead for Team SaaS Design, which is a task force that redesigned the SaaS website and rebranded it, which was very much needed. And I'll talk a little bit more about both of those things later. Breathe. Okay, so I'm going to start with one of my favorite quotes. It used to be that designers made an object and walked away. Today, the emphasis must shift to designing the entire life cycle. And that's by Paul Sappho. I care a lot about process and workflow, so I tend to think a lot about it. I tend to talk about it a lot. And I'm pretty excited because in my current position, it's basically my job, so it's awesome. So right now, style guides are all the rage. Everybody's putting their style guides online. Well, a lot of companies are, and they've come a long, long way. I really like style guides. The first style guide I ever worked on was when I was an intern at Odin Marketing and Design, which is a design studio in Memphis, Tennessee, where I used to live. And this was my first style guide, and it was a PDF. And basically, I documented the CSS that I was writing, and I documented the brand standards and like the grid layouts. And I learned very quickly that PDFs are not cool for maintainability, but I was still really into style guides in general, and so I still took that with me throughout my career. Fast forward to 2007, I worked at Apple on the Apple Online store, and I was working on a style guide for the store, because there's a ton of components and things. Similar as before, documenting the layouts and documenting the CSS. And I was so excited about doing this that I wrote an article about it on Apart. And the too long didn't read of that article is design and brand standards, documenting that, documenting your front-end development standards, and keeping your style guides current and useful. Current and useful is the really key part here. And I learned, so I did it on WordPress, because at the time, that was what I thought was a good idea. And I learned that WordPress was really only slightly easier than doing it as a PDF. And nobody except me would update it. And so as you can imagine, it got out of date, it was no longer current, and it no longer became useful, and it got scrapped, unfortunately. Sad times for me. When I worked at Engine Yard, I had no idea what Engine Yard even really did. I just took the job because it sounded interesting, and I had worked with companies before that developed with Ruby on Rails, so I was comfortable working in that type of environment. And so I took the job, and the first few things that I needed to do as part of my job was to refactor the CSS, to kind of learn the code base, and create a style guide. And this was the first time that I was required to use Sass. And at the time, I was very resistant. I thought I write perfect CSS. I don't need Sass. Are you kidding me? And then just a few days later, I realized, oh my gosh, I keep accidentally writing Sass in my vanilla CSS. I really like it, and now I can't stop talking about it. So you can blame Engine Yard for that. So the thing that I did when I was there was creating what people call a living style guide. And basically, that just means your style guide lives in the same code base as your application. And that's when I had like my big like epiphany, like, oh my gosh, Sass and style guides combined are really, really, really awesome. And there are so many talks and articles that you can read about Sass and style guides. I won't go into too much detail about that. But if you're curious about what my process was like during that time, I did write a blog post about it on their blog. And of course, this is already quite dated according to my current workflow, but it might be worth a read just to see how I achieved it back then. So a few years ago, I worked for a company called Do.com, and it was a company that was startup by Salesforce. We were a very small team, and we didn't really have a style guide, and we would do like hack days, like we would do 2-week sprints and then a week of hack days, and then 2-week sprints and then a week of hack days, which at the end of the year would give us about a month of total hack time, which was really cool. So I spent a lot of my hack time working on the style guide and building out the UI library. And when you build out a UI library, it's important to document the elements at the small level, and then the components, and then the layouts. And you might be familiar with Brad Frost's atomic web design. It's pretty similar in the approach of thinking of like atoms, molecules, organisms, and so on. And in doing that, it's also important to document the different types, the different states, and the different variations. An example that I think is really well done is the Android style guide. They go into a lot of detail with all the different UI elements, and they show press states, focus states, disabled, and so on. So for the web, that's pretty easy, doing an online style guide. But I also was working on the Android app, and I was working on the iOS app, and we weren't doing an HTML version of those apps. We were doing native apps. And so I wasn't really quite sure how to approach that at the time. So my approach was like I would design it in Photoshop, which I hate doing. I like to design in the browser. And then I would sync all the assets and the layouts and screens to Dropbox. And then I would post it on the project GitHub wiki. And each time we made a change, I had to go through that workflow over and over and over again. Not fun at all. So I'll touch on this a little bit more soon. So last year at SaaSConf, we launched the new website for SaaS. And of course, because I love style guides, I did a living style guide, and it's public. If you go to the footer, you can see the link, and you can check out the style guide. And what was really important to us was that we wanted things to be public. Here's what the site looks like. I drew those glasses. I'm really proud of them. And here's the style guide. It's still early. Like, there's a lot more I want to do with it. Some of the things we were playing around with was like a responsive sandbox during development, which just means having a bunch of iframes so you can kind of work against it. There's a really cool open source library to do that very easily. It passes a URL string to all the different iframes, and you can set what sizes and stuff you want. Of course, it's not an exact representation of what you're going to get on different devices, but it helps give you an idea. So, because we wanted everything public, we were going to open source this website where anyone could contribute. And, during building the site, it was fine. But then, once the site launched, of course, more and more people want to get involved and want to help. And there's been a lot of cool pull requests that have come through, not just content or typos or syntax fixes, but just like little design updates, like improving some of the UI of the site, which has been really awesome, and I'm grateful that people are doing that. It's the first time I had ever open sourced a website before, but the thing that I was concerned about was maintainability. What if a new color gets added? then the style guide needs to be updated too. And so I started thinking about, like, can the Sass and the style guide share a single source? You know, we're all familiar with the phrase, don't repeat yourself. So this is the approach I did then. Of course, I'm already wanting to refactor it. I always like refactoring. But here's how I approached it. So the site's built on Middleman, which is a static site generator built on Ruby. So you can use a lot of things like Haml, Sass, Markdown, or whatever it is that you like to use, Ruby gems, all sorts of stuff, but it's still a static site. And Middleman comes with the capability of using, you can have a folder called data, and you could put in YAML or JSON files in there, and then you can use that data in your static site. What some people don't know right away is that if your Sass is in a Ruby site or app, you can actually change the extension to .scss.erb, and it'll still compile as Sass, but now you can inject Ruby in there. And so what I did was I stored all my colors in a YAML file and named them, and then I looped over that in my Sass file to generate the variables, so I wouldn't have to rewrite those again. And then later on in my CSS, where I actually style the little swatches that are in my style guide, to create those classes, I loop on that again using the same data. And then the markup, this is in Haml, I loop on it again to actually draw the swatches. So now every time a color gets added, a new swatch just appears automatically, and we don't have to worry about updating the style guide. I thought it was like really, really clever, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna show the Sass team what I did, and they were like, yeah, we don't want you generating variables like that. I was like, well, give me a way to do this. And now with the new version of Sass, there's like Sass maps and all sorts of cool stuff, so I wanna go back and refactor this to be a little cleaner, but that's what I did back then, and it works. So late last year, do.com unfortunately got sunsetted, which was really sad for me, but also at the same time, very happy for me, because it actually was the time that I was already thinking about moving over to the core team of Salesforce, and it was just perfect timing. And it's pretty much like exactly this type of stuff that I'm talking about, and so it's awesome. So here's kind of some of the stuff that we're doing now. So as I mentioned before, style guides have to be current and useful. If they're not current, they're no longer useful. And there are a lot of tools that are being created right now around style guide generation. This is style.go, which is basically, you write your comments in your Sass files or less or whatever your preferred, or even vanilla CSS. You write your comments in a markdown format, and then it'll generate a style guide based on the order that it compiles, and it'll show examples, and it'll show the code. So this is pretty similar to how we do it on our Salesforce style guide. The style guide is actually what triggered me wanting to join the core team, because I just thought it was really beautiful. And so they're using, the current version is using Angular, Node. We're actually moving it to something else, but that's another story. But what we're doing is pretty similar. We store what the markup would be in comments in our Sass file, and we generate the style guide, but then we also use that in our prototype, so we can pull in different components from one source. And we've been tinkering around a little bit with Polymer to see if that's something we can explore, all using the same process. So that part's pretty cool. One of the things I learned at this role is design for enterprise has totally different challenges than what I had been used to in agencies and startups. A company the size of Salesforce, in particular, we have our responsive prototypes that our team builds. HTML and CSS. And we also have our responsive production framework, which is a separate framework that our engineering team works on called Aura. And it's like a totally separate code base. We're looking at how to converge. And of course, we have the work that we're doing for the new iOS watch, the various form factors for the phones, the tablets, the same with Android, the same with Windows. And we have multiple products, multiple acquisitions, and multiple partners. There's a lot to think about. And so my team is concerned about consistency and patterns. Like, we maintain the style guide. And so, like, how do we have this brand alignment across all these different form factors, all these different devices, and different platforms? Things like simple colors and spacing and sizing. Like, how do we keep that stuff consistent? And how do we make our future design changes easier? Like, if we're constantly iterating and improving, like having to talk to all those different teams and trickle down those changes is a lot of work. And of course, how do we keep our design system agnostic? Some people like Angular, some people like React, some people like Sass, some people like Less, some people like Stylus. There's so many different choices that a lot of those teams might have that we don't dictate, what they use. So how do we keep this agnostic? So we throw around the phrase single source of truth a lot. And I actually thought it was an internal phrase until I went to CodeMotion in Rome, and a speaker used it in his talk, and I was like, oh, I guess that's actually a really well-known phrase. I'd never heard of it before until now. But so when I started my role there, I showed what I had done on the Sass website, knowing that we weren't using Ruby, but I thought, maybe it'll kind of help spark something that we can do that's similar. So I showed the code base and what I did to the UX engineer that I work very closely with. And then within about a day, he already built an open source NPM module called Theo. And it's awesome. And we're using it. The teams throughout Salesforce are using it, and we actually already have partners and different products wanting to use it too. And so it has us really excited. And essentially what it is to hit all these different things that we use, like Sass, Less, Stylus, or JSON for iOS, since it's kind of moved on from pless, the XML format needed for Android, and so on. We store everything similarly to how I mentioned before with the YAML file. We store all our different design attributes in a JSON file, and Theo will convert the necessary files needed for all these different types of flavors. Let's just say flavors. So we write up, our team writes something once. So let's say color text is a value of 444. And then it generates a Sass file with that variable to be used. It generates a Less file for the teams that prefer Less. It generates a Stylus file. It generates an Aura file. And then the style guide, the markup needed for that swatch, is generated as well. And we also do things like taking into account to the way these different flavors like things. So color might be hex for CSS, or 8-digit hex for Android, or RGBA for iOS. And of course, metric units might be different, like SPs or dips for Android, rems, ems, pixels for CSS, and so on. And so when any of those teams are ready to do their next build, they just pull in the design values through Git and NPM. And we have no more hard coding of values, which is really awesome. We not only have the developers mandated not to hard code any values, but we also have our designers, if they're doing a red line spec, which is not fun, but if you are doing one, we have designers pointing to what we call tokens. They're variables rather than hard coding the values in there. And so everything just stays really consistent. And if we have to make a change, like maybe a color needs to be saturated more for accessibility, we don't have to notify like so many different teams to make that change. We can just make the accessibility change on our end, and then the next time they pull it down, they have it. We also have our assets, like icons and stuff, stored in a repository as SVGs, and we have another NPM module that's open source called Blender, and it will do the rasterization for fallback. And the style guide displays those assets automatically from that repo without us having to update it. So a change in one place changes everywhere, and we get truer consistency. And so the engineer that I mentioned, his name's Sanka. He is using the phrase living design system. And it's basically a collaboration between engineering and UX. And there's this engineer that I work with on the Aura team who told me he's worked at Salesforce for 7.5 years, and he's never felt like a closer collaboration between our groups until now. And so that has us really, really excited, and I'm really excited about where we're gonna go with this. And we also, because it's open source, we really want people trying it out and contributing and giving feedback. Sanka wrote this really awesome article about it on Medium called Living Design Systems, so you can read it from his perspective. I'm going to be doing a follow-up article in the next few weeks from the designer's perspective. And yeah, we're super, super excited about it. And if you're working in large organizations, or maybe even small organizations, and you have an idea that can make this even better, I would love to chat with you at the party. I love learning new things, and you might have a system that's like, makes this look silly. And if that's the case, please tell me. So the key thing I want to make a point, because I've been down this road many, many times before. First of all, you want to make documentation a regular part of your workflow. Like, don't just like say, oh, well, we don't have time to do this right now, so we're just going to wait until we have some tech debt time and do it. Let's be real, you're never going to do it. It always is going to be put off, and it'll never be done. If you just make it part of your workflow, it won't be as tedious as you might think. One thing that I like to do is when I'm building out a component, I build it in the style guide first, and then that's like, I'm half the way there. And so it becomes like a sandbox and a place to do like QA. If it's broken in the style guide, then you know it's broken elsewhere. But the other important thing I want to mention is not trying to document everything at once. I've tried, and another situation where you end up with some monolithic pull request that never gets merged because it's just way too much. And you're probably very likely to give up. Instead, what you want to do is document going forward as you come to things. So when you're making a new thing, document it. And if you're revising something, refactor it, and then document it. One of my other favorite quotes is by Gustav Flaubert, which says, "Be regular and orderly in your life so that you may be violent and original in your work." And you can tweet at us with ideas at Salesforce UX. We're also on Dribble at Salesforce. If you're curious about any updates on the SaaS site, we're at Team SaaS Design on Twitter, Team SaaS Design on Dribble. If you're ever in San Francisco and you want to speak at the local SaaS meetup there, I run it, just send me an email and I will actually plan an event around you coming. We've had 2 speakers visiting for some business meeting, and we would plan a whole meetup around it, and they've been really, really awesome. And that's it. You can follow me on Twitter, Dribble, Instagram, and GitHub at Jina. Thank you.